All right, so the U.S. is close to a deal with Israel and Hamas to, quote, pause the conflict and free hostages. Clearly, the Biden administration has been working tirelessly on this as there is mounting pressure from all angles to do better. And I'm going to show you guys this report. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see originally the Washington report. This comes from the Washington report just in the last few days. Originally, the Washington Post reported that the U.S. and the Biden administration had reached a deal. They then went back on that reporting and said, the White House disputed it, and now this is where we're at. As of November, this was written November 18th at 10:52, so as you're watching this, just in the last few days. And essentially, this deal, hypothetically, if it does go through in the next, it could be the day you're watching this, Monday. If you're watching this on Monday, November 20th, it would be a 5-day pause in the fighting, monitored by aerial surveillance. Could see, dozens of hostages freed, etc. We're still trying to learn more, essentially, about what this would entail. But Harry, I think my opinion here is like, we have a detailed, as the Washington Post says, I'm highlighting it here, a detailed 6-page set of written terms will require all parties to the conflict to freeze combat operations for at least 5 days, while an initial 50 or more hostages are released in smaller batches every 24 hours. It was not immediately clear, so there's some, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly the Biden administration under very intense pressure from both the far left to completely, or not really the far left, the majority of Democrats in general, people who are involved with the Democratic Party want a ceasefire. We're seeing polling around 80% of people want a ceasefire, but actual elected Democrats have been more scarce in calling for a ceasefire. Some call for a very conditional ceasefire, which would be something like this, where okay, we'll stop the fighting as long as hostages get released, etc. But under intense pressure, I think this is pretty impressive. What do you think?
No, yeah, I think this is like very, very impressive. It's a tough deal to come to because there's so many parties involved and there's so much passion, emotion, and everything behind it. As we've seen in recent weeks, this has been something that's been going on for weeks now in Doha, Qatar. Which, if you're on YouTube, you can see the talks have been going on for a very long time. This is something that the Biden administration pretty much has been working on since we learned that there's been hostages. Trying to get hostages back from a terrorist group is never an easy feat. So this is kind of like a 24/7 kind of a operation here. But it would be impressive. And the fact that they're even it was initially reported that there was a deal. Now it's like we're close to a deal. Regardless of that, even if we're close, it's still impressive that they're even able to get this far. And I think that this should definitely be a priority for people when we're thinking about this conflict here, and that there are still around 240 innocent people being held hostage in Gaza by Hamas in the tunnels that exist under the actual land. But yeah, and look, as you highlight here, the administration's highest priority in this Washington Post article for our audio listeners, however, has been freeing the 9 Americans and 1 permanent U.S. resident among the hostages. Quote, I think we need a pause, Biden said 2 weeks ago at a campaign event. A pause means time to get the prisoners out. It's obviously different than a ceasefire, but yeah, I mean, I think just overall it's impressive that we're even kind of at this point.
We've gotten this far, right? I mean, clearly the Biden administration has been working. I agree 100%. They've been working behind the scenes. They've been working very hard, and I think it's becoming more apparently clear kind of as we're over the next few weeks where we're kind of headed, maybe in terms of okay, we're gonna take the route of Israel is being very aggressive right now. The U.S. is obviously internally, just the administration is feeling lots of pressure to calm Israel down. In some aspect, and that has been very difficult. But in the last few days, even especially in the last week, we've seen even more moderate Democrats. I mentioned to you privately, like Jamie Raskin, John Ossoff here in Georgia, a couple others. I wouldn't call them moderate, but again, they're not part of the quote unquote progressive caucus, the technical progressive caucus, who's the one mainly calling for ceasefire. But they have come out and said we need a conditional ceasefire. We've seen people high up in the Democratic Party in general who are also Jewish who have said, we need some sort of conditional ceasefire, which I think has been the right approach. I think is the right approach. This is a pause, but maybe something that eventually in the next few weeks we'll see will be something where, okay, the fighting's going to stop completely, and where, all the hostages are freed, and here's essentially some complex plan to make sure Hamas is no longer in power that doesn't involve relentless bombing and, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so let me ask you this. Like, in your view, what would be the ideal ending to not only this agreement here, but a possible ceasefire? Like, what would that be in your view?
It's like the ideal conditions, you mean?
Yeah, like if you could pick, like if you're in that negotiating room, what would you say is the best?
Well, I think it's and this might not be a great answer, but I think it's complex in the sense that like there's some areas that like obviously we're like learning. It's very hard in wartime. I think the one thing that like I say quote unquote wartime, but the thing that people don't understand about any type of conflict, especially nowadays and our generation being so young, is you're seeing stuff on Twitter and all these places, and it's like real time, but you're like really getting accurate information days after it actually happens. So a lot of times you're like, you might have a perspective on something that's going on that will change very rapidly as we actually get the facts, at least if you're being genuine about looking at the facts. You might see one thing and then it may be disputed a few days later and then disputed again, and then that issue of whether it's a hospital or where a hostage is, etc., may not actually be settled for another week or two. So the situation is ever evolving, but I think that I mean, obviously, like the Jamie Raskin essentially said, I want all the hostages freed. I want condition for multiple groups to send like as much aid as physically possible, fuel, water, and food to the people of Gaza. And this would not just be like 100 trucks. This would be pounds and pounds and pounds from multiple different agencies all working together to essentially like flood Gaza with much needed civilian aid. And then so those are the two like absolute necessaries. The third necessary is some technical plan and an agreement, I guess, from Hamas that's like, okay, we're going to not do this anymore. We're going to step, and it's not just we're not going to do October 7th anymore. It's we're going to step aside. Someone else is going to govern. The question is, how actually likely is that? We know we're dealing with literal terrorists, people who have said multiple times they plan to do October 7th again, and they plan to fulfill what they believe in, which is that the state of Israel no longer deserves to exist, which means we can't have them in power. But, I mean, knowing the U.S. and how much play we have there, I'd be surprised that you can't push Hamas to a level to say, all right, we do not want to do this anymore. Step aside. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I think it's very complex. So what's ideal and what actually happens are two different things. But yeah, I think that ideally with a end scenario, we would want, as you mentioned, like having humanitarian aid for Gaza to make sure that the innocent people are okay. And as you said, like food, water, all the crucials. I think we also have to have a post-Hamas plan in place before anything happens, one of which that's including infrastructure rebuild, also just infrastructure building, because there's a lack of that in many places in Gaza, like sanitation-wise, sewage, things like that. Definitely need to have some a plan there, of which the international community helps with, including the United States. And as you said, there also has to be a deal where Hamas steps aside and the hostages are released. And then Israel also probably has to loosen up some of their control over the region in terms of like border crossings. And I'm just assuming that is what they're going to have to give up in order to get anybody to agree to any of this. But yeah, like something like that, something like where the hostages come home. I think like the three main pillars are hostages come home, Hamas is gone, and there's some nation rebuilding for Gaza, not just, like, well, let's just put Hamas back in power and see what happens, but, like something bigger than that. You're muted. Sorry, Chris is muted.
Sorry about that. No,
You're
that's the dream scenario, right? The question is, again, as I would argue that so much has gone wrong for Israel in the West throughout this conflict. The question is how likely is all that? And I think the biggest question mark is like for everyone the biggest question mark that's not talked about, like you just asked me, is for everyone calling for a ceasefire. What's the plan after the ceasefire? And it's kind of becoming clear to me listening to not just people actually calling for the ceasefire, but also experts is, there's some way to rid Hamas without continually, just this extensive, brutal bombing campaign. But I don't know that anyone really knows the answer to that. But I have a feeling that we're going to learn quite a bit more in the coming week or two.
Yeah, well, again, like I think you and I talked about this privately, but the problem with ceasefires is that they're never, ever, ever effective. Well, especially with terrorist groups, but also unless the people you're ceasefiring with, that would, in that case would be Hamas from Israel, unless they have like means of achieving their political goals and like nation building. So if you just if tomorrow they're just like ceasefire, everybody stop shooting, stop it.
Yeah, it's a huge.
We're going to be in the same cycle. It's going to be the exact same thing.
It's going to be worse. It's going to be way worse.
And again, like Hamas's leaders have been like, yeah, we want to repeat October 7th. They're like, they've said it. They're like, yeah, we want to do it over and over and over again.
Right.
So, you can't just be like, okay, ceasefire now. Joe Biden can't get up on the stage and be like, let's call for a ceasefire right now. Everybody's put down their arms, right? And then also that comes, you theoretically could for negotiations to go on, which would be great, if they just stop fighting for negotiations to take place. But then the issue is, does Hamas actually listen to the ceasefire, and does Hamas just use that time to rebuild? So, it's just difficult, I think. Like, there's no easy answer. There's no, I don't even know, there's an ideal situation. I just don't know how far the ideal situation is from reality. My guess right now is that it's very far.
Yeah, right. No, I agree. This, like I said, this whole situation has been very far from ideal. So I'd probably agree, but you can always hope. I think, and the one other thing that I think the Washington Post article mentions very briefly that I want to mention to people, because I think it's fascinating, right? Is not only is again, we've talked about how a lot of people in regards to this event assume that Biden has a lot more potential control than he actually does, right? The West has a lot of control. We've given Israel the most aid of any U.S. ally since World War II. We give them some, roughly $3 billion a year. We fund, extensively fund their military, right? So Joe Biden has sway, obviously. The West has sway. The question is how much sway, and the question is, I think our opinion is that if Joe Biden got up on a stage tomorrow and called for a ceasefire, that's not going to immediately, end the fighting. I think that's just a very common misconception when this is talked about online. But something the Washington Post article points out that I really like is that, Netanyahu is under, and I despise Netanyahu, but just the fact of the matter is he also has to agree to the deal, but he is under a whole different type of pressure because we saw this week huge rallies, huge protests in Tel Aviv of people in Israel saying, bring the hostages home. You're not doing enough to bring the hostages home. And of course, the people in Israel are not advocating for him to, commit. I'm not trying to suggest they're advocating for him to do more extensive bombing campaigns. They simply think he's not done enough to bring the hostages home. You haven't secured the people that we care about, we love, the Israelis that got captured. So not only is Netanyahu under this enormous pressure while people storm in the streets of the capital to say, you're not doing enough in some aspect, the rest of the world is hammering him, saying you're doing the most, you're doing way too much in some aspect. And then the West and Joe Biden is kind of playing this middle where we're trying to really put pressure on them to, back off while his internal approval ratings plummet. So I just think people should remember that we have to win negotiations with someone who, in all honesty, is under more pressure than Joe Biden is just internally. And that's Netanyahu, as his approval rating has dropped to, the mid 30% in Israel.
And that's just what adds another layer of complexity to this that I think a lot of people don't consider, is that the actors in this, that being at least from the Americans' perspective, Joe Biden, the United States government overall, we have Congress and stuff like that, but also Netanyahu and Hamas. It's getting these three parties to agree to a deal is a really difficult, especially something to end the conflict. And look, I think that as we were talking about what's ideal, what's versus what realistic, I think what's realistic right now, and I think what people have to accept, is that there will not be a ceasefire. There's just not going to. I genuinely don't see a circumstance right now in which there's a ceasefire,
really?
unless I think there could be a temporary 5-day thing, as we were talking about. But overall, as a ceasefire, I genuinely, in my heart of hearts, do not think that no matter what Joe Biden says on the stage, Netanyahu is going to stop, nor will Israel and kind of like the IDF want to stop. And I like the United States can scream about it. People can scream about it in the streets. And I think that, again, like as we were talking about, a conditional ceasefire is the right way to go. And I think the United States is probably working on that behind the scenes because, public and private things are different. But I truly do not believe there's going to be a ceasefire anytime soon. I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, I mean, and in general, I'll just say, like, I probably disagree with that, but I also see the argument because, again, as you say, the thing that the people in the U.S. don't realize is, this is all very, to Israel's credit, I think this is a situation where there's so much ingrained in the history of Judaism, just not, and I'm not talking about the whole history of Judaism, I'm talking about the last 100 years in regards to, obviously, World War II and the constant anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a very strong sense that I think, like, a lot of people who call for a ceasefire, don't understand that this is something that the IDF and the people of Israel, and it's totally valid, are just not going to stop until they are safe from, someone who brutally attacked them on October 7th, which is understandable, especially as I've, seen people, even very outspoken people on Twitter, say the same thing. But to that point, I think that, I don't know, I'm kind of convinced that, my concern at this point, Harry, is not that there may not be a ceasefire, because there may not be a ceasefire. My concern now is that I think Joe Biden has to call for a ceasefire. I think that regardless of what the Biden administration is saying about how likely it is to actually succeed, the reality of the conversation, it doesn't matter if you believe a ceasefire should or shouldn't happen. Mm-hmm. And it's really hard for me to say that because these are innocent lives I'm talking about. So I'm being brutally honest right now. Regardless of that issue for 1 second, the Biden administration has to be thinking, like, is this not like really hurting the 2024 campaign? Like, what's your thought on that? Like, we see polls that 80% of Democrats want a ceasefire. We see polls that between 66 and 70% of Americans want a ceasefire. And that's like a very broad question, because I agree with you that most Americans aren't going to conceptualize the idea of, like, what that actually entails. But I think Joe Biden's under a tremendous amount of pressure. And as we see that pressure grow, I think he might have to just do something.
Yeah, well, I think Joe Biden is going to eventually have to call for a ceasefire. I mean, the pressure is just so immense. And we also have to, like, weigh the pros and cons. That being, like, the pros are like, oh, we don't piss off Israel and we still have, like, a really strong allyship there. And, like, we get to, like, have that influence behind the scenes and push them to be better in Palestine. Like, don't, like, fucking turn off the water, right? But then I think the cons I think cons are very much present. It is absolutely hurting his campaign for 2024. And on the flip side of that is Trump, right? Like, the problem is that Biden is fighting like a 9-front war right now. I've been
there.
You've been there. You know what it's up. He's like fighting a 9-front war right now, and there's a lot of fires going on that we're all trying to put out, and the Biden administration is trying to put out. But it's just tough. So I think eventually he's going to have to, but we'll see. I don't know.
Okay. So it's let me before you go, I want to ask you a question.
All right.
I want to ask you a question that may interest people and may not. Who knows? In terms of people being active on social media, using their voice and saying, I think that no matter my gripes with Biden, the right choice in 2024 is Biden because it can't be Trump. This idea that even if, and I've seen people interviewed at pro-Palestine rallies, very, very passionate. They say, I really, really think it's horrible Joe Biden's not calling for a ceasefire, saying some really awful stuff about Joe Biden, but saying at the end of the day, I'm going to vote for him because X, Y, and Z. So my question to you is, if you're on social media, if you're someone who's trying to use your voice just in person with people or on social media, like, is the best route for, what's the best route for people talking about this issue to help Joe Biden get reelected? Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you understand what I'm saying?
And I'm actually, I really want to hear your view about this, because we might disagree or we might disagree 100%. I think that I love, and I think you agree here, I love young people standing up for what they believe in and fighting for what's right, and like being vocal about it, being involved and being engaged. But there has to be conditions on that. You have to be informed. You have to weigh your words matter. People's words really matter, especially if you have a platform. You have to be very careful with your words and the message you're sending, and be informed. So when young people are talking about this, or people who have platforms or whatever on social media, I'm perfectly happy for them to disagree with Joe Biden. They could say, like, I want a ceasefire right now, but what I'm not happy with is when people are like, I want a ceasefire, but Joe Biden's not doing it, so that's why I'm not going to vote for him. I think that is a dangerous line of reasoning, and almost a faulty line of reasoning when you break it down, because then you're just letting Donald Trump get into office, who would never, ever call for a ceasefire, might I add. Right. But I'm like, so I'm curious, that same question to you, like, what do you think is the most effective way for people to talk about this on social media, and like, how do you want to see it happen?
And the reason I ask you is because people, I had a couple people close to me ask me, and I always emphasize for, whatever, it's hard because, you may say, as you talk to people on social media or in person who actually care about what you have to say, or, say, maybe you're talking to a brother or a sister or a family member who like may actually change their vote or vote differently based on how you're feeling. It's hard to explain to someone a lot of times with politics nowadays because it's so divided. People expect you, especially it's all because of Trump. People expect you to be, you either love everything he does, or if you say something bad about him, you must hate him. And there's really this, like, there's no in between. So I think that it's important for people on social media to emphasize, to always say exactly how you feel, to tell the truth, to say, I think X, Y, and Z. I think Joe Biden should really call for a ceasefire because of this. I'm really passionate about because of this. I'm angry because of this. But preface why, your voting decision will still be the same, or vice versa, why it will be different. But I think it's important, as, like, things are so inflamed right now that it's very easy for someone to turn on the camera and say, I want a ceasefire right now. I'm very upset. Okay, fair. But I've watched it balloon into a lot of people saying, kind of hopping on this train of, I'm not voting for Joe Biden, when the original person wasn't really saying that in the first place. You know what I mean?
Mm. No, I mean, that's a fair point. It's just, as you said, it's just like very inflamed right now. It's like there's a lot of emotions. And I think that, in this conflict and kind of like what's happening right now, I always am like, what's going to be the attitude of the people 11 months from now? I have to stop saying a year from now because the election will already be over. But like, what is the attitude going to be like 11 months from now? I think this situation is so volatile. What's up?
Go ahead. I actually have a really funny point to what you just said. You said, like, it's so volatile. I just asked someone very close to me the same question. I was like, I don't know how people are going to be feeling about this issue in a month. People are calling it the disaster of Joe Biden's presidency. This is so funny. Do you remember the Chinese air balloon?
Oh my God, yes,
yeah,
dude.
Look at your face when I said that. You haven't thought about that in months, but at the time, that was being touted as like this mid area for Joe Biden's presidency of like, this is what's going to kill him. His national security, he let a Chinese spy balloon fly over the country. I remember people talking about it like, we've never had a president do something like this. He doesn't care. And I saw Fox News bits about how that was going to end his presidency. I forgot that happened. Everyone forgot that happened. Whether you're Republican or Democrat. I haven't heard that in months.
And look, I think like to your point, like, when was the last time that a Ukraine war story was front page? When was the last time?
Right, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, that probably 2022, right? Well, 2021 maybe.
Right, and that's what's going to determine the outcome is again, like, hopefully factually what's actually going on in these regions. Like, if there's some progress on the Israel front that people can be hopeful for, and there's some progress, to your point, on the Ukraine front, where it feels like Ukraine's actually making progress and the U.S. dollars we're sending to both countries are doing something for good, for peace, for whatever, and that's the vibe in the air, then hypothetically he'll pull it out, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, I think. I mean, yeah, I don't know. We'll just see.
We'll see.
God,
But
man,
yeah,
so much.
no, it was a good conversation though. This is fascinating.
Yeah,
It's fascinating. So we'll have to see where the U.S. goes in terms of their position on the deal with Israel. I think to close out on this for now, it's that we're looking at death tolls for Palestinians of close to 11,000 plus, and we're looking at death tolls for Israeli citizens in the thousands as well, which I will pull up right now. And I want everybody to remember that Joe Biden is under, and the U.S. are under, tremendous amounts of pressure from all angles. A lot of the right answer is not so clear all the time. And so to just be mindful of that when you're looking at social media, to always do your research and always remember at the end of the day, domestically, anti-Semitism and any type of Muslim rhetoric has no place here, period. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's like something that I really want to hammer on going forward is I think the anti-Semitism specifically in the United States is raging right now and is not being talked about enough. So again, as we always say, if you're personally affected by this, we on whatever angle, whatever side, we wish you the best, truly, because it's horrible.
And
now,
also, just one to add on, like if you're also affected by this, personally affected by this, our DMs are always open. We're always happy to talk to you. And if you have opinions, obviously drop them in the comments or just like DM us. We're everywhere.
Right, exactly. Well said. Or you can email us at questions.
Oh yes.
Yes, questions at cmhsunplug.com. It'll be in the link on whatever you're watching. Questions, or the bio, I'm sorry. Not the bio. The description. Questions at cmhsunplug.com. I appreciate you mentioning that, Harry. Yes, our DMs are always open. Our DMs are always open. So with that being said, that's kind of where we're at on Israel, and we'll probably talk about it again next week, Monday, 1 o'clock as well. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on this week was, some of what Trump's been up to, which is a lot because Trump's up to a lot every day of his life. He's been in court quite a bit with, his fraud case. He's been, the lawsuits appeals are going back and forth to all these different cases. He just lost a case in, technically he didn't really lose or win, but there was the opinion case in Colorado about that he's allowed to be on the ballot, but it was a huge ordeal because it ruled that he actually did participate and cause an insurrection. So a lot of Donald Trump stuff going on. But this is what I wanted to pull up. This is from NPR I'm reading from. Donald Trump made a post, and he's used multiple times now in recent rallies, the term vermin, vermin. And essentially, this has not gotten enough press anywhere except really, a lot of Democrat circles. But it's really, really, really scary stuff. Really scary stuff. I'm going to read the exact quote. From the Trump rally, quote, "We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country." And that was in New Hampshire, and that was very, very recently. And as the NPR article points out, this is very scary because that's some I'll say like that's 1930s and 1940s Germany. I mean that's a very authoritarian, very like down the white supremacist alley. And obviously we've seen, the same type of authoritarian stuff from Trump before that everyone seems to normalize nowadays, being an election denier and his immigration policy moving towards 2024 where he's going to, hypothetically, he wants to ramp up his immigration his immigration reform like tenfold and set up these camps and do these mass deportations. It's really scary stuff. But I think, I saw a few people talk about this, but I think it went a little bit under the radar that he's, not just saying authoritarian, fascist, absolute insanity of election denying and his immigration policy, but we're literally hearing him use language that's like almost identical to Hitler. And as this person says, the language of rooting out vermin, the reason why authoritarian leaders use that is because it does dehumanize their political opponents. and it leads to political violence. That's the goal. It leads to political violence. You're dehumanizing, a group of people that Donald Trump just alleges as Democrats.
Right.
And of course, how many Republicans do you think spoke out about this and said it was a bad thing?
Big fat zero, or at least
A big
national
fat zero.
Republicans.
A big fat zero.
No, and to your point of, let me just put something up on the screen real quick here. To your point of Donald Trump's language being that of authoritarians and comparing it to like Hitler in 1930s, 1940s Germany. Here's a good graph by the guys over at Midas Touch, the brothers. They put this together, kind of comparing some of Hitler's quotes to Donald Trump's, and you can see this, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So, for example, Hitler said, "I will get rid of the, quote, communist vermin." Trump said, "I will get rid of the communist vermin." Hitler said, "I will take care of the, quote, enemy within." Trump also said, "I will take care of the threat from within." Hitler had, obviously, his main philosophy was that Jews and migrants are poisoning Aryan blood, and Trump has also kind of echoed that in a different way, saying migrants are poisoning, and this is a real quote, "are poisoning the blood of our country." Hitler said, "One people, one realm, one leader." Trump has said, "One people, one family, one glorious nation." And when you put them side by side, it's like, wow. He's using this quote "vermin," which was very, very popular at the time. It's like, wow. It's pretty disgusting, pretty concerning, and the fact that like nobody's really speaking out about major Republicans are not speaking out about it is also very gross. And I also like to remind people that I think it was like Trump's ex-wife post divorce said that he kept a book of like Hitler's quotes on his bedside table. It's just something to think about, maybe some food for thought in the broader scheme of this conversation. But like this is what we're up against, folks, and this is no joke. This is. Man, it's just done with intention. There's a reason why Trump is using words like vermin,
Right, exactly. And as the saying goes, is that history doesn't repeat itself. History doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes or something like that.
Yeah.
Something. And that essentially, like going, as I talked earlier about using your voice on social media, like, and I've seen many Democrats point this out, is we see stuff like this where we're like getting really clear warning signs about what could happen moving forward that we've already seen in the past. We've already heard about Donald Trump's plans for immigration, these mass deportations, Project 2025, gutting climate change, gutting the DOJ, gutting, all these horrible things. And it's odd. So many news outlets are so focused on polls and polling rather than what, like, the actual substance of what either candidate, what their plans will actually do for the country, And I saw this pointed out, and I'm not really big on attacking the media. Like, I don't kind of like that whole narrative, even from Democrats. I really don't like it because it feels very Trumpy to me. I'll be honest. It just feels Trumpy when you're like, oh,
I've done
media.
that.
Right. That's fair. That's okay. And we could talk about it. Let's have a conversation about it real quick. Cause I don't know. I've never done it before, but I did find it a very interesting point that like everyone wants to talk about how Biden's underwater with all this, but nobody will like take just a second to be like, these are Donald Trump's clearly outlined and factual plans for if he gets elected in 2024, and this is what will happen. And obviously people have done that, but it doesn't feel like major media companies,
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I think that's like a problem. So like when I just said like we've had, I've had my own problems with the media. Like on Twitter, I've been like the media won't talk about this, which I think is a lot of the time it's true. And maybe that's a broad term, and I probably shouldn't have said something like that. But yeah, I think like that's something I'm like really having a problem with the media right now. Is that they love they're writing constantly about Joe Biden and his campaign and him being old and things like that, and like all these different things and his approval rating here and there. But it's also like, ladies and gents, boys and girls, everything in between. Have you heard Trump speak recently? Have you he has taught like how is Joe Biden getting lower approval ratings? Or in terms of how he would handle the Palestine-Israel conflict, than Donald Trump when Trump is saying, yeah, let's ban Muslims again. Let's institute our Muslim ban.
Yeah.
Let's give Israel free reign. How is that possible? And I think it comes down to a failure in the media. And I think I've actually seen a lot of journalists recently on Twitter being like, it's our job to do this, and we're not doing it effectively enough. So that's my overall problem. And I think, like, again, like, I think that when it comes to, like, the Trump trials, if it's not, like, happening right now, I don't think the media talks about it enough. Like, there's so much happening in the Trump trials in D.C. and Georgia.
I agree with that.
And it's not really being talked about by like national media. It's kind of focused on Israel-Palestine. And like kind of more stuff like that. And I get it because that's kind of the issue of our time right now. But we also have an election that's like a year away. And we also have historic nature with somebody being, a president of the United States, former president of the United States being charged with serious crimes. And it's just not being talked about. So that's like the main problems I have. But you're right. It does sound kind of Trump to be like the media.
I mean, it does. It does. But honestly, when you put it like that, it makes sense. And I'd be curious after the podcast to see what, like some of the journalists you're talking about on Twitter talk about it. But I do think that, like, it's, becoming more clear to me in the last few weeks that, like, we're going to see a huge shift, I believe, after, maybe in the coming year, but specifically probably after 2024, and like how media portrays polling and how these polls are conducted, because there's a lot of things in a lot of these polls that are just they never add up, even in the same polling that, done by the same people, that just don't make sense. Is usually, not only off, in practice, but off logically. And so I don't know. And as I've seen recently, a lot of people say, quote unquote, he's underwater with Gen Z right now, or like he's lost a lot of support among Gen Z. Someone pointed out, someone I really like on Twitter pointed out, Gen Z, these are all polls done via phone calling, and when you poll Gen Z, they tell you in polling that they don't answer the phone for polls. They do way more online polling or in-person polling than they do phone, answering the phone. And in real practice, that's like real shit, because I don't know about you, bro, but like all I do is hang out with like 21-year-olds like myself all day. I've never seen anyone answer a random phone call, bro.
Yeah. No. I have like this thing on that blocks like numbers I don't
recognize.
Yeah,
I'm not answering that, bro.
I'm not answering that, bro. I'm just not answering that.
Right.
So that's a problem. It's like I wonder how these polling I haven't seen much adaptation from these polling companies in terms of methodology, like to adapt for what Gen Z's doing. I really don't know who these Gen Zers are who are picking up the phone, dude. Who are these people?
I don't know. It's bizarre. It's very bizarre. I agree.
It's bizarre. But I also, and like I saw a poll today or something like that. I think it might have been out of Michigan, where this is so crazy. Joe Biden was losing like the 18 to 29-year-old vote by like 5 points, but was winning the plus 65 vote by like 16.
Oh,
what?
Yeah, no.
You saw that poll?
No, I didn't. But that sounds exactly like a poll I'd see on Twitter and just be like, oh, yeah, this is definitely reasonable for sure.
Yeah, like
yeah, dude, it makes no sense. It makes no sense.
I understand that, young people are mad with Joe Biden right now, but I really would be very, 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 very surprised in 2024 if it's like young people are voting for Democrats by like only 5 points.
I agree. Well, yeah, I mean, I even saw, I think it was an NBC poll from today, as we're recording this on Sunday, that says, Gen Z 18 to 24, Joe Biden has a 1-point lead based on their poll from yesterday. And I was like, you're telling me when you poll Gen Zers, it's 48-47 Biden? I'm like, something's up, bro.
That don't sound right to me. That don't sound right to me.
So and again, in practice, all of these polls end up just like, especially lately. And again, I hate to trash on polls or the media because I genuinely like respect that job, and I think it does like a lot of damage when you discredit reasonable media, like the Trump, right? That's kind of why it feels Trumpy to me. But it is reasonable to say, for whoever's doing the pollings, like we're gonna see, I think, a major shift in the practice of how it's talked about and how it's done, because again, we saw it in 2022 in the midterms where the polls are all suggesting a massive red wave that just isn't. There is no massive red wave, right? And we see this actually like mini blue wave and this big Gen Z support that the polls suggested wasn't going to show up. You had kind of like more inside people saying, some of the books I read, even like some of the people that don't really do polling but are kind of on the inside of politics, say there's a real potential for Gen Z to show up in this 2022 midterm. But all the polls were saying it's flat. They're probably not going to show up. We'll see. And then there's this big wave. And then obviously in the 2020 election, we saw Joe Biden win young people by 28 points. I think
something
he's up
like that.
28, 26, 27. It's something in there. And in 2 years, Trump gained 25 advantage points amongst young people.
Yeah, like what has changed? I'd be like, maybe we're just Maybe we were underestimating. Yeah, maybe we're just too invested.
Yeah,
I don't know,
maybe you were too invested. I mean, we'll have to see.
But like, what has changed in the past? No way Israel and Palestine has changed youth support from, we want abortion rights. Yeah, we care about climate change. Yeah, education to be funded should be like, yeah, America first. You know, no way, dude.
Well, also, like, if you poll those people, I'd be curious, like the NBC poll that's splitting them. Like, what happened? I'm sure there's, some amount of Gen Zers who picked up the phone who would have said Biden, who probably said, I'm not voting. I guess that just takes the total number of people polled down, and then they call more people.
I just don't know, dude. Maybe we're just dumbasses. Maybe we don't know enough about polling.
Maybe we don't know enough about polling. But regardless, it's interesting. You should look into it. But yeah, and you should also continue, as Harry and I said, to use your voice on social media, as we have a president of the United, or a potential president of the United States. For the Republicans, 91 felonies, use language like Hitler, talk about how he's going to scrap climate change, etc. And that needs to be everyone's focus going into 2024 because it's scary shit, and we cannot let Republicans win. So with that being said, I know that this was a little bit of a shorter episode today. As you can see, possibly by my background, I might not even put my video on just because I feel like it looks a little ridiculous. But I'm kind of in an odd location here. I'm like kind of in a closet of sorts because unfortunately I had some personal issues on where I was recording. But regardless, as I didn't really intro in the beginning, this has been Chris and Harry Unplugged. We're two Gen Z liberals who talk about politics, scream about politics every Monday at 1 p.m. If you check the link, there's a link to this hoodie I'm wearing, which is our merchandise with our faces on the back. It says Unplugged. You can check it out. Each hoodie bought has one tree is planted, and they're made domestically in the United States. And we also have a Patreon now, which we just released bonus episode 1. If you are subscribed to the Patreon, the support goes a long way for us, and you get bonus content, live streams, a Discord, or you can chat coming soon with members and chat with us. So it should be really cool. So you can check that out too. And we really, really, really appreciate all the support lately. It means a lot. You guys are truly the best. Like the video, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever, so you get the notification every single weekend. And we'll see you back here next Monday. Be safe. Peace.